February 1945. The cockpit was so cold that breath froze on the instrument panel. She flew without lights, without radio, without anything that might give her away to the German gunners below. The biplane's engine had been cut to idle. In the darkness over the Oder River, she was a ghost made of canvas and plywood, gliding toward a target she could barely see. Below her, men slept in bunkers who would never wake. Above her, stars she had studied as a girl in Moscow now served as her only navigation. Her name was Senior Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova. She was 23 years old. She had flown more than 800 combat missions. And tonight, like every night, the Germans called her the Night Witch. But here is what the history books rarely ask. What if she had never flown? What if the women who broke codes, who ran intelligence networks, who smuggled weapons and flew bombers and built the machines of war had simply stayed home? The answer is not speculative. It is documented, measurable, and staggering. This is not a story about women who supported the war. This is the story of women who decided it. The war began, as wars do, with men making decisions in rooms far from the front. But within months, the machinery of total war had consumed every available man, and the question was no longer whether women would serve, but how completely the world was willing to let them. In Britain, the call came quietly at first. In 1939, the government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park began recruiting linguists, mathematicians, and chess champions. Among them were women, not as secretaries, not as assistants, as cryptanalysts. They arrived by train to a Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire, carrying suitcases and secrets they would keep for 50 years. The work was abstract, maddening, invisible. They sat in wooden huts that smelled of coal smoke and damp paper, staring at columns of letters that meant nothing until suddenly they meant everything. The German Enigma machine produced 159 million possible settings. Breaking it required not just mathematics, but intuition, pattern recognition, and the kind of obsessive focus that turns hours into minutes and days into a blur. Joan Clark was one of them. A Cambridge-trained mathematician, she became the only female cryptanalyst working in Hut 8 alongside Alan Turing. She earned less than her male colleagues. She was denied the title they held. But the intelligence she helped extract from encrypted German naval messages directly enabled the Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. Without her, without the women in Huts 6 and 8 and 3, the convoys that fed Britain would have starved. The island would have fallen, and D-Day would never have come. But Bletchley was a war of the mind, fought in silence. In occupied Europe, women waged a different kind of battle. It began with small refusals. A shopkeeper in Lyon who would not sell bread to German officers. A teacher in Warsaw who hid Jewish children in her cellar. A farm wife in Normandy who let British paratroopers sleep in her barn. These were not soldiers. They had no rank, no uniform, no protection under the laws of war. If captured, they would not be sent to POW camps. They would be tortured, and then they would disappear. And yet, they chose to resist. In France, women became the backbone of the resistance. They carried messages, transported weapons, scouted German positions, and ran safe houses for Allied airmen shot down over occupied territory. The Gestapo called them terrorists. The Allies called them agents. But to the men and women who survived because of them, they were something closer to saints. Nancy Wake was a socialite in Marseille when the war began. By 1943, she was the Gestapo's most wanted person in France, with a 5 million franc bounty on her head. She led a 7,000-strong Maquis network, coordinated parachute drops, killed a German sentry with her bare hands, and cycled more than 500 kilometers through enemy checkpoints to replace lost radio codes. She survived the war. Many did not. Noor Inayat Khan, a British SOE agent of Indian descent, was a children's author and a pacifist before the war. She parachuted into occupied France in 1943 as a radio operator. Within weeks, her network was compromised. She refused extraction. For months, she transmitted intelligence from Paris while the Gestapo hunted her. When they finally captured her, they sent her to Dachau. She was executed in September 1944, 3 months after D-Day, the invasion her transmissions had helped make possible. She was 30 years old. The brutality they faced was not incidental. It was doctrine. The Wehrmacht and the SS understood that women in the resistance were not auxiliary threats. They were operational corps. A male agent could be replaced. A radio operator who knew a dozen safe houses, who had memorized drop zones and recognition codes, who could navigate a city under curfew without raising suspicion. She was irreplaceable. And so, the reprisals were designed not just to punish but to terrorize. In Oradour-sur-Glane, after resistance activity in the region, SS troops locked the women and children of the village in a church and set it on fire. 642 people died. The message was clear. Resistance would be met with annihilation. And yet, the networks held, because the women running them understood something their occupiers did not. They were not fighting for territory. They were fighting for the idea that some things cannot be taken by force. Dignity, memory, the right to say no. These are not abstractions when your children are hungry and soldiers are in your streets. They are the last pieces of sovereignty a person can hold, and women held them. In Poland, the Home Army included thousands of female couriers, medics, and intelligence officers. In Yugoslavia, more than 100,000 women fought with Tito's partisans, many in combat roles. In the Soviet Union, women were not just auxiliaries. They were snipers, tank commanders, machine gunners, and pilots. And it was in the Soviet skies that their impact became impossible to ignore. Marina Raskova was already famous before the war. A record-breaking aviator, she was the Soviet Union's Amelia Earhart. When Germany invaded in 1941, she personally petitioned Stalin to allow women to fly combat missions. He agreed. By October 1941, 3 all-female air regiments had been formed: the 586th Fighter Regiment, the 587th Bomber Regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. The latter became legend. The 588th flew obsolete Polikarpov PO-2 biplanes, slow wood and canvas relics that had no radios, no guns, and no parachutes. They flew at night, at low altitude, gliding over German positions with their engines off to avoid detection. The wind through the rigging made a sound the Germans described as the rustling of a broomstick. They called them Nachthexen, night witches. The women flew up to 18 missions a night, navigating by moonlight and intuition, dropping bombs by hand. They faced anti-aircraft fire, searchlights, and Luftwaffe night fighters. 23 of them died. 30 of them were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor. Nadezhda Popova flew 852 missions. Irina Sabrova flew over 1,000. Their contribution was not symbolic. In the Battle of the Caucasus, in the Siege of Sevastopol, in the drive toward Berlin, the 588th destroyed supply depots, ammunition dumps, and troop concentrations that would have slowed or stopped the Soviet advance. They were not flying for propaganda. They were flying because the war required it, and because they could. Across the Atlantic, the question was not whether women would serve, but whether America could afford to keep them out. In 1942, factories that had made cars and refrigerators retooled to produce bombers and tanks. But the men who had worked those assembly lines were gone, training in Georgia or shipping out to North Africa. The solution was obvious. It was also revolutionary. By 1943, women made up more than a third of the American workforce. They welded hull plates on Liberty ships. They riveted wings onto B-17s. They assembled artillery shells, tested engines, and operated cranes. The image of Rosie the Riveter became iconic, but the reality was more complicated. Many of these women were not middle-class housewives stepping in for the duration. They were poor, black, indigenous, immigrant, women who had always worked but never in jobs that paid well or carried respect. The war gave them both. It also gave them leverage. In Detroit, in Seattle, in the shipyards of California, women demanded equal pay, safe conditions, and child care. They struck when those demands were ignored. And they won, not because the government was sympathetic, but because production could not stop. The war would be won or lost in factories, and the factories ran on their labor. Between 1941 and 1945, American industry produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million trucks. None of it would have been possible without the women who built them. But some of those women wanted more than a factory floor. They wanted to fly. Jacqueline Cochran was one of the most accomplished pilots in America when the war began. She proposed a program to train female pilots to ferry aircraft from factories to air bases, freeing male pilots for combat. The idea was met with resistance. The Army Air Forces did not believe women could handle military aircraft. Cochran proved them wrong. In 1942, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, the WASP, was established. Over the next 3 years, more than 1,000 women ferried every type of aircraft in the American arsenal: fighters, bombers, transports. They towed targets for live anti-aircraft practice. They tested repaired aircraft. They flew in every weather, over mountains and oceans, without the benefit of military status. 38 of them died. They received no military honors, no benefits, no recognition. When the program was disbanded in 1944, they paid their own way home. It would take more than 30 years before they were granted veteran status. But in those years of service, they delivered more than 12,000 aircraft. They proved that skill, not gender, determined who could fly, and they forced the military to confront a truth it had long avoided: competence does not ask for permission. In the Pacific, the war was different. The distances were vast, the combat savage, the roles for women fewer. But even there, the impact was undeniable. Australian women served as coast watchers, radioing intelligence on Japanese fleet movements from isolated stations in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. In the Philippines, American and Filipino nurses were captured on Bataan and Corregidor and spent the war in internment camps, maintaining a covert hospital under conditions that would have broken trained soldiers. In China, women operated in the intelligence networks that fed information to Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers and later to the Office of Strategic Services. In Japan itself, women worked in munitions factories under conditions so brutal that thousands died from overwork, malnutrition, and industrial accidents. They did not choose this service, but their labor sustained the Japanese war machine until the final months, when American bombers turned those factories into crematoria. The war did not ask women for consent. It demanded their bodies, their labor, their lives. And in return, it gave them a glimpse of what they could be if the world let them. But it was in the ruins of Europe that the fullest measure of their contribution became clear. As the Red Army drove west and the Allies drove east, they found the camps: Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Ravensbrück. The last was a camp built specifically for women. More than 130,000 women passed through Ravensbrück between 1939 and 1945. Tens of thousands died there, from execution, medical experimentation, starvation, and disease. Among the prisoners were resistance fighters, political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, Jewish women, and anyone the Reich deemed undesirable. They were worked to death in factories producing uniforms and munitions for the Wehrmacht. Some were selected for sterilization experiments. Others were simply shot. The women who survived did so through networks of mutual aid that mirrored, in miniature, the resistance networks outside the wire. They shared food, hid the sick, sabotaged production, and smuggled out testimony. When the camp was liberated in April 1945, Soviet and Polish forces found fewer than 3,000 survivors. The rest were ash. But among the documents recovered were sketches, poems, and scraps of testimony hidden in walls and floorboards. They were a record, they were proof, and they were a message from women who knew they would not survive but refused to be forgotten. The end of the war did not bring the recognition they deserved. In Britain, women were expected to leave the factories and return to homes they had not lived in for 5 years. In America, Rosie the Riveter was replaced by the image of the suburban housewife. In the Soviet Union, the women who had flown and fought were celebrated briefly, then quietly pushed aside as returning male soldiers reclaimed their roles. The Night Witches were disbanded. The women snipers were told to stop talking about the war. It was not that their service was denied. It was that it became inconvenient. A woman who had commanded men, who had killed and survived and proven herself equal in every measure, was a challenge to the social order that men were eager to restore. And so the stories were minimized. The contributions were footnoted. The names were forgotten. But the evidence remained. The decoded messages, the sabotaged railways, the planes delivered, the missions flown, the intelligence that turned the tide. These were not marginal contributions. They were operational necessities. And the historians who sifted through the archives after the war found something undeniable. In the calculus of victory, women were not a variable. They were a constant. Consider the mathematics of Bletchley Park. By 1945, 3/4 of the staff were women. They operated the bombs, the electromechanical machines that tested Enigma settings at a rate no human could match. They translated decrypted German messages. They analyzed patterns in naval traffic, identified U-boat positions, and tracked convoy movements. The intelligence product, codenamed Ultra, was credited by Eisenhower with shortening the war in Europe by at least 2 years. 2 years. How many lives does that represent? How many cities not bombed? How many camps liberated months earlier? The number is incalculable. But the contribution is not. Now consider the French resistance. The SOE deployed 55 female agents into occupied France. 16 were captured and executed. The rest coordinated supply drops, sabotage operations, and intelligence networks that supported the D-Day invasion and the liberation of France. Without them, the resistance would have been fragmented, undersupplied, and unable to coordinate with Allied command. The cost of that failure would have been measured in months of additional occupation and tens of thousands of additional deaths. Now consider the Soviet air regiments. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment alone flew more than 23,000 combat sorties, dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs, and was credited with numerous tactical victories in the defense of the Caucasus and the liberation of Crimea, Poland, and Germany. They were not a symbol. They were a weapon. The same pattern holds across theaters, across nations, across roles. In every case where women were allowed to serve in capacities that matched their abilities, the impact was measurable and significant. The question, then, is not whether women changed the course of the war. The question is why we spent so long pretending they did not. Part of the answer lies in the structure of military history itself. For much of the 20th century, the history of war was written as the history of battles, and battles were understood as the domain of men. The contributions that fell outside that narrative, intelligence, logistics, resistance, production, were treated as secondary, even when they were decisive. Women's work was invisible not because it was small, but because the lens was too narrow to see it. But part of the answer is more uncomfortable. To acknowledge the full scope of women's contribution to victory is to acknowledge that the limitations placed on them after the war were not natural or necessary. They were political. If a woman could navigate a bomber through flak and darkness, why could she not navigate a career? If she could break codes that baffled the best minds in Germany, why could she not lead a university department? If she could endure torture rather than betray her comrades, why was she considered too fragile for public life? These questions had answers in 1945. They were just not answers the men in power wanted to hear. And so, the women who had changed the war went home and were told to forget. Some did, some could not. Nadezhda Popova returned to civilian life, became a flight instructor, and rarely spoke of the war until late in her life. When she did, her voice carried the same calm precision she had used in the cockpit. She did not boast. She simply stated facts. She had flown. She had survived. She had done what was necessary. Joan Clark left Bletchley Park, married, divorced, and worked quietly in academia. She never received public recognition during her lifetime. When the story of Bletchley was finally declassified in the 1970s, she was mentioned, if at all, as a footnote to Turing. It was only decades later, long after her death, that historians began to reconstruct the true scale of her contribution. Nancy Wake became a legend, but even she found that fame was a poor substitute for purpose. She spent her later years in a London hotel. drinking gin and telling stories to anyone who would listen, trying to reconcile the woman she had been in the war with the woman the world expected her to be in peace. She never managed it. The war had made her dangerous, capable, free. Peace made her obsolete. But memory has a way of resisting erasure. In the 1980s and 1990s, as archives opened and the women who had survived grew old enough to speak without fear, the stories began to surface. Documentaries were made. Books were written. Monuments were raised. The night witches were celebrated in Russia. The Bletchley Park women were honored in Britain. The WASP were finally granted the recognition they deserved in America. It was late. It was incomplete, but it was something. And it mattered, not just for the historical record, but for the women who came after. Because the story of women in the Second World War is not just a story of what happened. It is a story of what is possible. It is proof that when the world stops telling women what they cannot do, they do everything. They break codes and fly bombers and run networks and build tanks and survive torture and win wars. They do not do it for glory. They do it because it needs to be done, and because they can. And when the war is over and the men come home and the world tries to go back to the way it was, the women who served carry with them a knowledge that cannot be unlearned. They know what they are capable of. They know that the limitations placed on them are not truth. They are choices, and choices can be changed. The war ended in 1945, but its consequences are still unfolding. The women who built bombers and ferried planes and operated radios in occupied cities did not return to a world that welcomed them. They returned to a world that tried to pretend they had never left. But they had, and the world they left behind was smaller than the one they found when they came back. They had seen too much, done too much, become too much to fit into the roles they were offered. Some adjusted, some did not. But all of them carried the war forward into their homes, their families, their work. They taught their daughters that strength is not masculine. They taught their sons that courage is not exclusive. They became teachers, engineers, nurses, pilots, politicians. They became the generation that would raise the women who fought for civil rights, for equality, for the vote, for a world that recognized what the war had already proven. And in that sense, the women of the Second World War did not just change the course of the conflict. They changed the course of history, not because they were allowed to, but because they refused not to. There is a photograph from 1945. It shows a young woman in a Soviet uniform standing beside the wreckage of a German bomber. Her face is unsmiling. Her eyes are elsewhere, focused on something the camera cannot see. She is one of the night witches. She has flown more missions than most men will ever fly. She has seen friends die, cities burn, and an empire collapse under the weight of its own cruelty. And she is 22 years old. The photograph does not tell you her name. It does not tell you what she did after the war, or whether she lived a long life, or whether she ever spoke of the things she saw. It only tells you that she was there, that she served, that she mattered. And perhaps that is enough. Because the lesson of the women who changed the war is not that they were extraordinary, though many were. It is that they were ordinary people who were given, or who took, the chance to do extraordinary things. And when that chance came, they did not hesitate. They did not ask for permission. They simply acted. And in acting, they proved that the only thing more dangerous than a world at war is a world that underestimates half its people. The men who fought the Second World War deserve every honor history has given them. But the women who fought beside them, who built the weapons and flew the planes and broke the codes and ran the networks and refused to surrender, deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered not as helpers, not as symbols, but as what they were: warriors, strategists, builders, and survivors. They were the ones who changed the course of the war. And in doing so, they changed the world.